thank you everyone for being here. I just want to start by telling you all a little bit about the Belong Online Literature Festival. The Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF, is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and library for literature. You can learn more about these on belong.net. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not have been possible. Now, on to today's session. Today, we'll be discussing the women in history, and this will be moderated by Monobina Gupta. Monobina Gupta is a consulting editor at The Wire and also the author of Left Politics in Bengal and Didi, a political biography. She's also currently writing another book.
Very warm welcome to everyone. On behalf of The Wire, I heartily welcome you to this segment of the Belong Online Literature Festival. We are here to discuss the subject, as it's titled, is the Unforgotten Women in Indian History, Why We Must Remember. I'll go on to make some introductory remarks, but before that, let me introduce the panel to you. We have Mukhoty, Archana, Garodia, Gupta, and Angellica, Aribam. So I'll just tell you a bit about them. Mukhoty is the author of Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens, and Begums of the Mughal Empire, and her earlier book was Heroines, Powerful Indian Women in Myth and History. Her new book, Akbar, the Great Mughal, a biography of India's greatest monarch, was released in May this year. Angellica Aribam is a political activist working to amplify women's political leadership in India. Named one of Forbes India's 30 under 30 in 2017, Angellica is a former National General Secretary of the NSUI, which is attached to the Indian National Congress, and was also the first student from the marginalized Northeastern region to be elected in Delhi University. Archana Garodia Gupta is the author of The Women Who Ruled India. She writes on retail, women's issues, and history for newspapers and magazines, including columns for The Hindu and Indian Express. She's the co-author of the best-selling 2-volume A History of India for Children, published by Hachette. So I thought, when we had this chat, I think once before, we decided that we should talk about the contemporary moment, which is the moment when we are discussing the unforgotten women in India. And when we expand on the topic, we are actually trying to look at why are women's voices rarely heard, and if and when they are heard, they are represented in a particular manner, which is more in the stereotypical male kind of image rather than their own voices. As we are passing through these extraordinary times of COVID-19, and we see how it has impacted women of all sections and classes, we've seen, if on the one hand, we've seen migrant working women, on the other hand, we've seen college-going women being pushed back to their homes, being confined within the 4 walls. We've seen a high incidence of domestic violence, and women are basically bearing the brunt of suddenly being hemmed in, of having to give up their hard-fought kind of personal autonomy and freedoms. So I would like to begin the discussion with kind of asking the panelists to reflect on this basic question of how do they kind of see these times as impacting women, and how do you think these stories of women who are passing through these really severe times of distress, how do you think they will be written and or should be written? Shall we start with Archana? Yes.
In a way, Monobina, these are very interesting times, because what is happening today in terms of going out of the house, it is mirroring what things used to be in India, say even 50 or 70 years ago, where women were essentially confined to the house and they there were certain expectations from them when they were in the house, and they did not have an opportunity to go out or, no escape from whatever the demands were. So, in a way, the dynamics, the family dynamics would, given a similar situation, it's likely that the dynamics would also reverse to what dynamics there used to be. But I think, I mean, it's a bit perverse, but men are also confined, right? Maybe to a lesser extent, but they are also confined. So, in a few cases, I don't know to what extent, but men who were typically outside and they were not taking part in domestic chores, many of them have now learned to do things which, they never ever did because they had a role outside and they don't have a role. I mean, now they don't have that role outside, so there's no reason not to participate. So I think that itself will also, at least in many households, will bring about some kind of change in the equation. I mean, you see, once a person has made a cup of tea for himself or washed a dish for himself, you can never say, I can't do this. So I have a very positive hope that this will also come about. Of course, there is a rise in domestic violence, but I'll tell you something. Every time there is a change and women's rights when any rights are gained by women, there is always a rise in domestic violence. If you see that when people start working, when they start earning, there is a rise in domestic violence. And as part of my women's studies, and this is something I feel very strongly about and I've been advocating it, is that women who own property in India, only 5 to 10% of the property is owned by women. But women who own property suffer distinctly less domestic violence than women who don't. It's a study by Oxfam. And so that comes about, women's rights are also about culture, but in the same culture, it's also about power and economics.
Ira, would you agree that the sudden kind of domesticity of men, if is possible? Is there possibility of men learning to make that cup of tea which they never did, or perhaps just pour themselves a glass of water, which also they would have never done in the past? How do you see it?
Well, Monobina, I see that as a potential minefield to answer that question, so I will neatly sidestep it and tell you that I am altogether more pessimistic than Archana, unfortunately. And perhaps it's because of the sort of studying I do, the sort of books I read. It is based on history, on how women's voices are recorded in the past in India. And I came across this shocking figure, quite a while back when I was doing my work, and it said that of recorded history, so say a time span of 5,000 years, which we constitute as recorded history, only 99.5% of that history is men's history. It concerns the acts and achievements of men. So only 0.5% of women's voices have been recorded in the past 5,000 years, give or take a little bit. So that is a very dismaying figure. I myself, when I started writing about women, I was told, what is this nonsensical venture you're getting into? There are no women's stories. There is no women's history. You're going to waste your time. That turned out to be patently untrue, but that's a different point. We'll come to it later. And, way back, I think in 1894, a US suffragette woman, Matilda Gage, wrote about the fact that scientific achievements by women tended to be ignored by men. They were not noted down. And 100 years later, in the 20th century, a Cornell professor actually termed it the Matilda effect. That to this day, women's achievements in the sciences will be given lesser credence. It will be expected that this is a lesser achievement. And we've seen it in that Hollywood movie, Invisible Figures and things like that. So coming to data, you might think that, okay, data is a gender neutral thing. We will gather data in the same sort of way for men as for women. But Caroline Criado Perez, this this British woman, wrote this book called Invisible Women, I think, a little while ago. And she said that there's an inherent bias in the way in which all data is gathered around us. So the data to do with public spaces, public transport, health, even things like the phones that are designed, they are all gathered in a bias that accepts the regular or human figure to be a male figure. So that is your standard person for whom they are gathering the data is a middle-aged, say, male figure. And the woman is the outside person, and this comes from the ancient Greeks thought of the men as the rightful figure, and women were, I think they called it mutilated men, and even women's, reproductive organs. It was as if the female body was turned inside out, and the testicles landed up inside the body out of mistake. And it was only in the 17th century that ovaries were given a separate term altogether, not just testicles which were inside the body. So you see this inherent bias, and it affects everything around us. Even such essential things like the designing of PPE kits today. We see in the West that these sizes are too big for most women to wear because the standard size for which they have been designed is a male size, and they are much too large for women's bodies. The gloves are much too large for women's hands. When cars are designed, they use this sort of model to test out their safety procedures. And this is a male figure that they have designed as a robot. So when the cars are designed, accidents that happen are much more catastrophic for women because women are lighter and smaller. So the belt doesn't fit as well. The structures around in the car do not correspond to a woman's slighter frame. So this has huge effects, from the slightly negligible to not being able to reach up in a store for the object which is on the top of a grocery store, for example, to really important ones like a bodysuit not fitting properly. So for this reason, I find it extremely worrying about the way in which women's voices are going to be recorded in this pandemic. I think there will be male denial to a huge extent about the disproportionately large effect it has had on women. And this Lakshman Rekha, unfortunately, which has come up because of the pandemic, is going to be used and reinforced again and again to erode all the advances that have been made in the freedom of women, in their mobility, in their access to education, to the outside spaces. So it wasn't long ago that Menaka Gandhi suggested that if college-going women wanted to stay safe in their college dorms, they should think of a Lakshman Rekha around them. And I find that really abhorrent that in the 21st century, we should put again the onus of women's safety on themselves and having to stay within this domesticated Lakshman Rekha. So I am a great deal more pessimistic, and I think we're going to have to work very hard to get these women's voices recorded.
Or Archana may want to jump in, but I would like to go to Angellica for her thoughts. So this Lakshman Rekha, because we are repeatedly reminded that there is a Lakshman Rekha around us, and transgression of any kind.
Yeah, and today we seem to be living within the Lakshman Rekha all over again. And the United Nations UN General Secretary gave a statement a couple of weeks ago, and he was very clear in his thoughts, and he said that this coronavirus lockdown across the world has sort of took back the women's movement to around 20-30 years to where we were, right? And I would disagree with what Archana had said about men being able to pour a glass of water from themselves, because that is something that we're seeing from our positions of privilege. Because we don't know the kind of atrocities that women are dealing across India, for example, and especially in rural areas where men do not want to take any responsibility, and they're within the homes and they're expecting their wives or their daughters to serve them all the time, to do this, to do that. And there is this, of course, the rise in domestic violence. If, for example, the month of June in itself received the highest number of cases, NCW received the highest number of domestic violence cases in the month of June, right? So, and if this is something that's going to keep happening. And in terms of accessibility as well, when there's online education happening, young women are killing themselves because they don't have smartphones. Because in most lower income families, a family usually have one smartphone or one laptop to study from. And when there are two children, like a boy and a girl, the boy gets the preference of it. And the girls, for example, a girl in a Dalit girl in Kerala killed herself, one in Punjab killed herself, and just 2 days ago, a father in Tripura killed himself because they were not able to provide this basic for their daughters, right? So it's gender is become really, really, even though it might become, I mean, in terms of history, in terms of the COVID task force that has been come across the world, there is a lack of women in the COVID task force. While on the other hand, we talk about the countries which are led by women and how remarkably well they are doing in terms of dealing with the crisis, right? But like Ira said, there is data. When we look at data, there is invisibility of women in data. For example, I study women in politics in India, I mean, thoroughly. And one of the things that we have come to see is, it was only in the 1960s that in India, the election commission started segregating data for male candidates and women candidates. Before then, no one even knew how many women were contesting elections or how many women are actually winning those elections at different levels of the government. So when we look at data, we see how women have been invisible over a period of time. And it was only after 1995, the Beijing conference held by the United Nations, that people have started to see gender and they started to mainstream gender into policy making. Like tools like gender budgeting have come into practice to start looking at gender and collect data related to women specifically. But now we are all stuck in a situation where we are confined within our homes and, within the Lakshman Rekha. And unfortunately, it's going to take us back more than, a couple of years.
Just before Archana may want to respond to some I don't know if you would like to, but I just wanted to, because what Angellica said, and because she works on amplifying for women, I just reminded that this 33% women's reservation bill, which has been pending now since 1996, I think.
The first women's reservation bill that came in India was at the Panchayati Raj level. It was proposed in 1989, but it was implemented in 1993. Yeah.
That was Rajiv Gandhi. But I'm talking about the 33% reservation, which would ensure 33%.
At the Lok Sabha and the assemblies, that was introduced in 1996 by the Devi Gowda government.
Right, and this has been pending, and while they rammed through, here we are also talking about the Lakshman Rekha, which the politicians actually kind of draw around where women are allowed to come in. So I see that the fact that every other bill, a quota, which is guaranteed quota for every other vulnerable section, has come in, but this is just languishing,
Yeah, so, it's been 24 years, and it was passed in the Rajya Sabha only in 2010. After which, it was not even allowed to be tabled in the Lok Sabha. So violence broke out, and regional parties start attacking each other and tearing the bill in the house, right? In fact, the law minister who was trying to present the bill had to be guarded by 2 women MPs in the front and 2 women MPs at the side so that he's not attacked by other member of parliament. And it is rather unfortunate, the fact that, in the highest, it's the parliament, and you expect the lawmakers to be more, to be debating and to be discussing issues, but then rather they're breaking out into violence and they're saying, okay, this bill cannot be tabled. And, that kind of utter chaos, it shows the mirror to us within the political system of where the men want you to be. You have to be within that Lakshman Rekha in the political sphere as well.
Yeah. Archana, I would like you to, if you would like
I just want to say a couple of things. So, as a student of history, there have been landmark moments in history where you've seen a distinct change in women's rights. The first, of course, is, you could say, the Neolithic agricultural revolution, which distinctly limited women's rights, right? As hunter-gatherers, they had far more rights than they had in settled communities. In more recent times, say the First World War or the Second World War, both created substantial changes in women's rights. So when we think about gender rights, these are some things that stand out. Now, regarding COVID, is it that 50 years later, are we going to look at this year as something that permanently affected women's rights world over? I have my doubts about that. I don't think it's going to change things about dramatically, but more immediately, you see, if you look at women's participation in the labor force in India, uh, it has been falling. It used to be nearly close to 40% in the early 1990s. And in the 1970s, it was up to that. And now it's falling year on year, and it's now about 23-24%. That's because the economy is growing, and typically as you get better off, women start staying at home. But it's also a reflection of the jobless growth, because if there are people unemployed in a family, the women are the ones who are who get fired first, or who don't get a job first. Now we are going to see post COVID, there is going to be a lot of economic distress, particularly in India. A lot of industries have shut down. I was chair of FICCI MSME committee. You see the kind of devastation that has taken place in industry. I think men are going to lose jobs for sure, but women are going to lose jobs to a greater extent. They are going to be economically more affected. And because they are going to be economically more affected, all their other rights alongside that are going to be more affected. But that the whole thing, I don't think it's going to be a permanent psychological, I don't think it's going to culturally, I don't think COVID is going to culturally change the position of women worldwide. I don't think so. India, yes, there will be some economic impact for a while, but the overall impact of what is happening in the country may be much greater than the impact of COVID in terms of women's rights.
Before your word on this, then we'll move on to your.
Yeah, I'll just revert in 2 points. That's about it. Yeah. Number one, the fact that I don't know whether it's going to be long term or not. I think it's going to be long term, because of the fact that if we see the projections of the child marriages that are going to increase in the world, right? So it is estimated that 12 million more child marriages are going to happen in the next 10 years. I don't know that is substantial enough for Archana to acknowledge as a shift in women's rights. Number two is the fact that a lot more of the girls are going to be pulled out of the schools by their parents, because of the fact that, economically it's not feasible for them because of economic crisis. When they have to make a decision to send their children to school, they would rather pull out the girl child than the boy child. So that's number two, where a girl's education is going to be impacted really well. So child marriages and girls' education, I think education is when, you can empower yourself and you can have a job and you can get independence in the world for women. It's a sort of asserting their independence. But if you don't have education and if you're married off early, I think that's a step back in the movement.
And you're going to have job losses for women for sure. So that's at 3 levels.
So can I now move on to your specific areas of work? So Ira, let me come to you first. So Daughters of the Sun, fascinating. You wouldn't have the time to go into all aspects of it, but something which struck me, and I think you mentioned in a media interview that one of your favorite characters was Gulbadan Begum, Babur's daughter, and who was later asked by Akbar. She lived through Humayun's and Akbar's reigns, and she was asked by Akbar to write a biography of his father and grandfather. And so I want to go back to what you just mentioned in your remarks, that the fact that in that period, we had these highly intellectual women who were writing, who were producing texts, and you've rated this biography extremely highly. So there is, in a way, this erasure of women as intellectual, thinking creatures, who and a tendency to always kind of project them as emotional rather than being able to think and analyze and, what would you like to say? Tell us all a bit about Gulbadan Begum, and what did she represent to you when you came across her?
Yes, definitely. You know, that's an excellent example that you've chosen, one of my favorite figures. And she, you know, represents a lot of what we have been talking about. Not only that women's voices, you know, exist, but there's male denial about it, how that denial comes into work, how it affects future generations, and how it affects the essential recording of women's voices. So as you were saying, you know, in the 1580s, when Akbar had created his empire and he was ready to write a biography of his life for posterity. He wanted to make a record of his legacy. And of course, he had Abu al-Fazl to do that for him, but he needed primary recordings, people who had lived through the reigns of Babur and Humayun, and for these people to write down their own personal, you know, memories of these times. And he asked a number of different people, one of whom was his aunt, who was living with him at that time. She was in her mid-60s or so. She had just completed the Hajj after 7 exciting years. She had come back to Fatehpur Sikri. And so he asks his aunt, you know, who had lived a tumultuous life through the reigns of Babur and Humayun, to write down all that she could remember. And Gulbadan doesn't hesitate for a single moment in her introduction. She says, well, the Padshah asked me this, so I'm setting out to do this. You know, there's no hesitation, despite the fact that what she is doing is a singularity. There has never been such a document before. A Muslim woman from within the harem recording. There is no such thing. So she could not base her writing on a blueprint. You know, there was no previous example, but she had the confidence in herself, you know, in her nephews asking her of this thing. And she said, yes, I will write of my you know, memories of this time. And she writes this amazing document, you know, Gulbadan's Humayunama. And what happens is that, you know, we were talking about this last time, she makes this one copy of her journey, and it is almost entirely immediately forgotten. You know, it is not referenced in the biographies that come later, all the Persian language biographers, all the men who write about this period, Abu al-Fazl, so on and so forth, so many of them, they do not you know, refer back to this amazing record and say, well, according to Gulbadan, whereas Gulbadan herself had recorded the memory of several women, according to Hamida Banu Begum, Khanzada Begum. You know, it is a wonderful source, not just of one woman, but an entire harem. Yet these men completely ignored this written record, and as a society, as a country, we forget about it. Nobody remembers anymore that this woman called Gulbadan wrote about Akbar's life too. And it was only in, I think it was the mid-19th century, a Colonel Hamilton with the EIC was traveling around the country, and he was buying up huge amounts of manuscripts, you know, Indian manuscripts, paintings and writings, and he bought, you know, tons of them. And then he died, and his widow needed to raise some money. So she sold about 1,000 documents to the British Library. And there they languished in the British Library for decades. And the early 20th century, Annette Beveridge was translating some of these documents and realized that one of them was the recording of Gulbadan Begum, you know, and she was amazed at this thing. And yet, for decades again, it was ignored by modern historians, once again relegated to a footnote. Oh yes, there is this recording, but we are going to place it right there and not really reference it at all. And it was a feminist historian, Ruby Lal, who one day looked at this document, studied it in depth, and wrote a groundbreaking work called Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World, in which she studies this record of Gulbadan and says, you know, wait a minute, this is giving us an entirely new perspective on the harem, which we used to think of as a cloistered, static space. Is not that at all. It is a place which moves continuously with the emperor. It is part of, there's no public and private segregation. They are part of the private life. They interact with the, you know, with the Padshah, with the princes. They are very important, you know, makers and creators of the empire too. So it took a woman like this to bring this out and to make, you know, a big splash about the fact that this document needed to be seen once again. So, you know, 300, 400 years that this book was, you know, lying ignored. It just shows, it really exemplifies the fact that a woman, even when she writes down her own personal recordings, will tend to be immediately disregarded and ignored. So it was entirely thanks to this work that I was able to begin Daughters of the Sun, because until then I thought it won't be possible. So you can see the knock-on effect down the centuries to me today in the 21st century, how important it is to have that woman's voice so that I can create a sense of what the harem was in the early years. And for the later years, I have Jahanara Begum, you know, again, another woman whom we've entirely forgotten, but she wrote 2 biographies, The Daughter of Shah Jahan, and those 2 are yet to be translated into English. So just to give you a very small sampling, of how very fragile women's voices are in history.
It's absolutely fascinating. The fact that, I would use the word, I don't know, even if it's not deliberate, but the sheer indifference to something which exists, that shows that how you've completely erased the works of women. I mean, it reminds me a bit about the Dalit historiography in my home state of West Bengal, where the fact that there is this whole history of caste oppression and exploitation, which has come to be acknowledged only recently. And it's fascinating. I mean, it's really, which is where we come back to. We don't know how these stories, these times will be told. Stories about women, I'm sure there'll be lots of stories around men. And
I'm sure, yes.
But, about women. So, before coming to Angellica, Archana. So this is something which I wanted to ask you about. You argued that we shouldn't make women the kind of the repositories of virtue. We shouldn't. I mean, they're not goddesses, or they are not. They are humans, and they have to be looked at with all their vices and virtues like everyone else. And I think in your work, you have tried to talk about women who've actually kind of led different kinds of lives and pushed social boundaries. And here we are talking about the social boundaries and conventional, arrangements, families and institutions. So would you please like to comment on this?
So I'd like to, there is this very famous Sanskrit shlok about what are the virtues that a woman should have. It's something very often quoted. It's karyeshu dasi, like a dasi in work, karaneshu mantri, bhojeshu mata, feed you like a mother, shayaneshu rambha, rupeshu lakshmi, and kshamayeshu dharitri. In kshama, in forgiveness, you should be like the earth, which forgives everything. Now, we expect an ideal, this is the definition of an ideal woman. We expect an ideal woman to have all these virtues. And if she fails in even one of them, then she is considered a failure, right? For a man, if he does well in one of them, he is a success. And that's the difference in the kind of load of expectations that you place in a woman. And it's for a woman that you consider kshama, like dharitri, to be a virtue. For a man, you would necessarily not consider that a virtue, you would consider that a weakness. So for me, I'd just like to talk a little bit about when I was selecting, was doing 20 short biographies of women rulers. When I started looking, because I have to decide which 20, so in the old Indian way, I said, okay, we should have north, south, east, west, Hindu, Muslim, Jain, Bodh, Christian. Let's cover as much variety as we can. But one thing, when I made my preliminary list, I had about 120 women who have ruled at various points in various parts of the country. It's not the country, it's a continent, right? You have to think of India as a continent. So that's why you can have so many kingdoms and women ruling them. And I think I'd like to say that not one of them had got in their position of rule starting from the grassroots. All of them had got there because they were related to the previous ruler in some way. But post taking charge, they were as good or as bad as any male ruler. I think all of you are familiar with Dr. Johnson's quote, where he says that a woman in public life is like a dog walking on two legs. The wonder is not that it does it well, but it does it at all. So a lot of people just are amazed at women being in positions of power because, but if you look at the differences in governance, for example, I would hold that Ahilyabai Holkar's Indore was probably the best governed state in India in the 18th century among all the so many splinter states which were there in the 18th century. Now, regarding, and you see that whole variation amongst these 20 rulers that I've written about. Some were these models of virtue like Ahilya Bai, who would fit all the long list that we have of the virtues we expect from the nurturing mother. Some like Tarabai, who was also a Maratha, or Didda, or Begum Samru, who's nearby in Delhi. They were like, for want of a better word, they were closer to male rulers and the kind of virtues and vices that male rulers would have, the kind of decisions they would make. And a woman is supposed to be sacrificing herself for the good of everybody else, and that is tyag and kshama are great virtues for women. But as rulers, tyag and kshama may not be the best of virtues to keep your kingdom intact, or and so the question that you put, that we tend to put a burden of expectation on women where we expect them to be saints and all the virtues of a saint. And we can call Peter the Great when he had his son killed. And that's fine because he did other things for Russia. But if a woman steps out, even, what about the emails kind of step out? Her greatness, so to say, or her capabilities or her abilities as a leader, or what she has delivered to her country, become far less important than these so-called feminine virtues. So for me, it was very important to write about these women as they were, not hide any of the steps they did. Didda probably got her grandson killed because he didn't fit into her plans or what was to happen. So to either hide them or to criticize her out of the way for doing them, I think it's also not our place to make judgment calls as historians. Our place is to just put everything in a platter in front of the reader and let them make their own judgment calls based on their own thinking. We have no right to hide facts or gainsay them or put in a comment to dismiss their achievement or their fault. So I think that is the truth in storytelling about women is also important, because mostly all the stories which are told from a lens of a patriarchal perspective.
Okay, thank you. Angellica, your book, I wanted to talk a bit with you about your book, which is going to be later published this year. And you were saying it's about the women who played a significant role in drafting the Constitution. And it's only recently that we've got to know about their existence. I mean, before that, there was really no gender role at all. So would you like to talk about your forthcoming book? I think it's going to be published later this year.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, when we talk about India's freedom struggle, and then we talk about, Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, and the names that we think of the women who do come up to our minds are people like Sarojini Naidu. But what do we actually know about Sarojini Naidu apart from the fact that she was known as a Nightingale of India, which we were taught in school, right? And then we might hear someone like Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. Again, we don't know anything about what she did other than her name, and she belonged to the Nehru family. So it's kind of interesting when we talk about freedoms, the Indian freedom movement, but we tend to ignore the participants who were women and who were, like look at, for example, the non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement. Women played a very critical role in that, and they were a major chunk of the people, protesting and going out and leading those movements. And it so happens that we only happen to talk about the men. And even now, when our politicians or when any of us refer to them, we refer as the founding fathers of India. And we tend to forget that they were founding mothers of India as well. They were I mean, when we talk about the Indian Constitution, there was a Constituent Assembly who drafted the Indian Constitution, and there were like 15 women in there in that room discussing each and every law that was being, framed. So the book is focused on those women and what their contributions were to the building of India and the India that we see today. What have they, like for example, Annie Mascarene, for example, was this woman from Kerala, and she argued against the people in the room, and she against the whole idea of preventive custody. She was like, we have no right to, hold people without a just trial, take them in custody. It's not right. For example, there was someone like Begum Azaz Rasool, who went out and said that, even though she belonged to the Muslim League, she went out and said that she does not believe in separate electorates, And so these are women who were out there and who were fighting for rights for a lot of us, and the freedoms that we enjoy today, we owe it a lot to them. And that is what the book aims to bring out.
The thing is very interesting. Even when we take note of, let's say, we just chronicle perhaps the names. I mean, we note their presence. But noting their presence is really not enough. We also have to reflect their work. I mean, they actually contributed in meaningful ways. So there is, again, this is, I really think fundamentally from all the kind of work all of you are doing, and it's this elimination of women as intellectual beings. So either we talk about women's beauty, or we talk about their domestic kind of skills, or nurturers, but the fact of their intellectual capabilities, which is at par, if not more than men. So I just find it. So what you were just now saying, that the voices that women, the fact that women are actually taking a stand different, they're arguing in the framing of the Constitution, they're coming up with their own arguments. That's important to note. So, these are voices which are separate voices. I mean, you cannot just club them together, because they are thinking and they're coming up with their own arguments. Ida?
Yeah.
Any one of you just jump in on any of these.
Monobina, you just said something very interesting, and it made me think about something about how women, women are at par with men. And I remember something which was said by a former prime minister whom I interacted with very recently, and she was like, women just have to do the job twice as better than men, and it's thankfully that's not a difficult job at all. So it just took me back to that conversation.
Yes, I guess that kind of sums up the attitude. I mean,
I'd like to see something here in terms of what I see as why women's voices and why women are getting into the workforce in the last 100 years. And to me, it's basically the invention of contraception, widespread contraception, which I think is the basic technological change which has changed women's positions in this world. Because there was a study which I saw. They said that in pre-contraception days, today a woman has about 400 periods in her lifetime. In pre-contraception days, the average was about 40, because they would be either pregnant or lactating. So just this simple figure can tell you that the chances of a woman participating in economic life, in being out and about, if the average number of menstrual cycle she had was just 40, it means that she was absolutely not free to do anything. She was looking after children or whatever till the age of 40 or 45. The fact is that today, when your NFF has gone down to net fertility, number of children a woman has gone down to 2, has created a huge amount of time for women, which then has led slowly that presence of time, in improvement in law and order, strengthening of the state, has led to women's greater and greater participation in all aspects of economic life and life outside intellectual life. And I think it simply comes out of having a lot more time, much lower infant mortality. And that is the driving force behind this change. Now, of course, minds take, your ideological thing takes much longer to change than the fact of the matter. But so long as we keep pushing against the forces, which, the older forces, this change has to come, because effectively there's no difference. So how long will you keep the gap, especially when the women are pushing themselves? So I tend to be, I am pessimistic in the sense of course, there are forces working against you. But I tend to be optimistic that I think the long curve of history is with us. That even the graphs with this COVID, while you may see dips in all of them, it depends on the recovery curve and how fast it is. If we recover well economically, I think women's rights and women's positions will stay on the long-term trend. I don't think this will be a thing where we'll start moving down or the slope will change drastically.
So before we start taking questions, just some last comments perhaps just jump in, whoever wants to jump in first.
I can share an anecdote. You were saying that it's not enough to just share, just record women's voices, but it's still already a beginning and an important thing to have a woman's voice, a woman's name written down. So, for example, Akbar's first Rajput wife is Harkabai of Amer. She got the title Maryam-uz-Zamani quite early on. This was a way, in fact, of hiding a woman's identity by giving her a title, so you no longer knew much about her as a human being. It was just this awe-inspiring title. So Maryam-uz-Zamani became somebody that we knew as Akbar's wife. Today, if you go to Agra and you visit the tomb of Maryam-uz-Zamani, the guide will tell you this is Akbar's Christian wife. So I'm like, how is Maryam-uz-Zamani Akbar's Christian wife? He's like, why Mary? Her name is Mary. If Maryam becomes Mary, there's no longer any understanding of the fact that in Islamic law and, there's an understanding of Mary, mother of Jesus, being, a celebrated character, that this being an Islamic title, of a, in fact, a Hindu queen. And she becomes a Christian lady who was married to Akbar. And then we get misunderstandings like Jodha Akbar as well in Bollywood, because you forget her actual name. So just recording the actual name of a woman has been one of the jobs that I've undertaken to find the actual person hidden behind, say, titles or obfuscation.
Fascinating once again. Anything, Archana?
I just think that, it is very important to tell the stories of these women, because still there is this very strong perception that women are not as capable as men. And the only thing that's going to take this perception away is to actually see in front of your eyes that the job is being done. Even then, we don't attribute and acknowledge what they're doing. But eventually it is this which is going to keep chipping away at the, societal construct.
Angellica, since you've engaged with political structures, what is your? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? I know I'm using very, very simplistic terms. I know it can't be.
Yeah, I think in very simplistic terms, but it's a very complex situation to be in, to be really honest, because in a political sphere, which is where changes should begin, and because they're the ones who are making the laws for the countries, and it's pertinent that the change should begin at that table. But it's a very patriarchal system in there. There is a lot of sexism that exists there, and being a part of a political when I was a part of a political party for like 5 years of my life, from the age of 20 to 25, very young, and the kind of things that I have endured, basically straight down to how I should dress up, what the type of clothes that I should be wearing, whether I should be wearing lipstick or not, all those sort of thing, the basic social conditioning that happens in the political system. It's much more than other fields. And more often than not, women have to exhibit masculine qualities to show that they're capable leaders, So even though empathy, now it's very recent that we have started talking about empathy and compassion as leadership qualities, but women have been molded in such a way within the political system that you have to fight it out and you have to present yourself as a strong leader. And as a strong leader, the definition in itself means because as a strong man, because that's how the system has been built so far. So that factor exists, and it's going to take a lot of time because there is a lack of political will between the political classes to bring in change for women. And even though we talk about the law, the reservation quota, etc., but that's just one step. That's of course the beginning. That's about getting the foot in the door. But systemic changes are going to take a lot of time.
Okay, so this one says women's history has been erased, but some women face more erasure than others. For example, trans women, Dalit, Bahujan women, etc. In what ways can we make sure these histories come to light? Ira?
Yes, I've often been asked this at talks for my first two books that, how about the subaltern class and how about women from there? Why, and I've always said it's no coincidence that the women I write about have ended up being almost always elite women. Because if you have one small chance of being recorded as a woman, it's much more likely if you are, a king's daughter or somebody within the elite structure where you have some chance of being recorded. Otherwise these things are so fragile and so chancy. Like Amrapali, for example, in the 6th century BCE, we only know about her extraordinary journey and her story because she happened to be an exact contemporary of the Buddha. And, the Buddhists were extraordinarily good biographers and record keepers. So within that system, when she joined the nun and became a Buddhist nun, her voice was recorded. But if it wasn't for this chance encounter, we would know of no such Amrapali. So the fact is, for disenfranchised women, for trans women, for Dalit women, this chance of being recorded is even more slim and more fragile. So it is extremely difficult. And we would need to look at other sources which have always till recently been looked down upon, oral sources, legends, myth making. Maybe look at these as an alternative source and not follow the Eurocentric view that only recorded history makes sense, only recorded history is legitimate history. We need to actually upend the way in which we study history altogether, beginning from the fact and beginning from the classification of history. What can we include in the term history? Does it always have to be the power structure, the battles, the expansion of territory, and so on and so forth? Why cannot it be the structure of family, having children, nurturing children, the languages, the writings, culture? All these things are equally part of the history of a country. And I think once you start looking at history that way, you have a much better chance of finding these voices that we are talking about.
So there's been far more, I think, emphasis on political history rather than cultural history of society as it's evolved or not evolved.
Yes.
And unless, I think, history is defined like that, we'll get stuck in this.
Into the great man stories.
Yes. So the second question, I think, is quite similar to the first one, but any of you, if you want to come in, the very little representation that women have in India is mostly enjoyed by upper caste women of the mainland. As a result, their rule often reflects a casteist gaze. How do we understand this problem while discussing oppression and justice? Angellica? So coming from it's like I'm quite enjoyed by upper caste women of the mainland. So it is.
So it is kind of the fact that when I was going to research for my book, the one thing, that common thread that I found in all the women who were part of the Constituent Assembly, all 15 of them, was the fact that they were privileged women. They were educated, they belonged to rich families, they had access to education, and but the other thing is, some of them were critically, criticizing the power structures that were, and trying to, for example, there was Ammu Somidandan from Tamil Nadu who went out and who was who spoke for Dalit rights, because of the fact that she was a Dalit herself, but she was married to a non-Dalit, but then she had to face the struggles of being a Dalit. So one very interesting anecdote that I remember from her story is how she went on to question Nehru, and she said something like, the fact that you use the term Pandit Nehru is an assertion of your caste, and it shows that you believe in the caste, even though you say that you don't believe in caste hierarchies. It's an assertion of that very fact. Then Pandit Nehru replies to her saying that I have never used the term Pandit in front of my name. I have never used that term myself. Then she retorts and questions him yet again that even if you don't write it yourself, the fact that you respond to it is the fact that you believe in it. So there were women out there, even though they come from privilege, they have used that privilege to ensure that the people belonging to other sections of the society were not oppressed and there was justice for them. And this is something that is now with the rise of the fourth wave feminism across the world, right? Even in India, with the rise of the fourth wave feminism, what we see is feminists are not just talking about women's issues anymore. We are talking about issues of oppression across the spectrum and across the society, be it on the Bahujans or be it on, racial minorities like the Northeastern people, or be it in terms of the Muslim women, example, and LGBTQ people as well. So it's about oppression as a whole, and as the movement keeps on rising, we see that everyone is now understanding that there is no place for oppression in the society, and each one of us has a role to play in that.
So basically the question of oppression and justice, there has to be a solidarity of various groups.
Absolutely. Exactly. This is what the fourth wave of feminism is trying to do now, to ensure that there is a solidarity. So we see people speaking about Black Lives Matter, and racial, for example, the whole, when the coronavirus pandemic broke out and people from the Northeastern community were facing, I have been through it, the whole racism issue. So there is a rise of voices who are speaking up for justice across the board.
Yes.
But it's going to take time. Everything takes time, so it's a slow movement and it's building up, and hopefully we'll be able to reach at a point where there will be equity.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
What I was saying is that I think it's important to recognize that you have to build solidarities and not just go inwards. You can't just say this is my space and no one can come in, but you have to actually build.
We have to pass on the mic, basically, when we feel, when the fact that, if there is someone who is belonging to that. For example, I see a lot of cases in India when we talk of Savarna feminism, right? The criticism of Savarna feminists is the fact that they have tried to appropriate the whole movement for themselves without passing on the mics to others who might be able to tell their stories in a far better manner, and rather than appropriating their stories. So the whole responsibility lies on us to pass on the mic, to ensure that others have as much say in the discourse.
Okay, so this is interesting. I have seen many of my male friends. This is interesting. I have seen many of my male friends hesitating to buy / read books authored by women because they feel they might not enjoy it.
Yes.
How can we change this mindset? Really?
So this is something.
Yeah.
It's real.
It's very true.
It's not just about books, you see, mostly because I've been involved so much in women's issues. Yeah. Most of the talks about women's rights are attended, or women's issues are attended by women. It's just women talking to women. So yes, there is a role for women getting more aware of their own rights or getting motivated by themselves. But there is also a role for everybody in society to be aware of these issues, and as women alone can be a motivator in changing it, but for society to change, you need more than women to be involved in this change. And that's why women's stories need to be told and need to be, of course, the anger is there. Normally, whoever is the narrator of the story, women's story, especially if it's a woman, will have anger, and anger drives away people. Unless you're one of the people who, has also suffered alongside. So it is important to draw in. And I'm just looking at the next question, which they're saying that should it be included in school curriculum?
So if
I think, like
if I can link this question, because you're on curriculum, so I'm just sorry I'm interrupting, but I think this is linked. So that this question, in what ways can Indian education system update curriculum to include more women in history, and is the education system ready to change the curriculum? So I'm sorry, I mean, you can go on from what you were saying. And
I think before this book, I wrote this book, History of India for Children, which is a 2-volume thing, a comprehensive history of India. And I made it a very deliberate point to talk through, the 35 chapters, 30 periods of history, whatever that we're talking about, to talk about the situation of women, what was the change from earlier, and also try and include a couple of stories about women heroes who may be cultural or political or, whatever field, to at least whoever is reading it, and this book was not something which would be, only read by girls, right? To at least bring those stories to the fore, because a lot of the position of women's, a lot of it comes out of economic thing, which I firmly believe. But of course, there is a huge role of perception, both on part of the women themselves about what they're capable of, and more than that, by men about what women can do or can't do. So I think it needs to be brought in at the earliest possible level. Women's stories, women's voices need to be heard, amplified, and put out in the public space by all, by the education system, by television, by movies, because that is going to be a big aid in changing perceptions.
This one question addressed to Ira. I read a very interesting point made by Madhavi Mahadevan in her book, Conteas, that because history is written largely by men and their favorite subject is war, most of our epics and history is about war. It goes on to ask, since you mentioned the tiny amount of women writing history, could you elaborate on whether history and myth would have been different had they been documented by women?
Yes, I think, categorically that is so. They would have been different. And as I was saying earlier, we therefore need to challenge the way in which history itself is being written. And in a small way, I've tried to do that in my Akbar, in my new book. For the early person posing a question who said that her male friends would tend not to read a book by a woman. I feel perhaps with Daughters of the Sun that would have been the case, but in Akbar, the person will pick up the book and not realize it's written by a feminist historian, and will get a lot of information about women hidden behind, the great man figure. So I think this is a way subtly to go, but you have to use whatever arms are at your disposal. And so I made a conscious effort that when I was going to write about Akbar, I was going to write about as many women as I could find that influenced him, that were part of his life, that maybe just existed without doing a great deal, like Gigi Anga, his foster mother, but who he loved so dearly. So I was going to put in as many feminine names in there as I possibly could. And that is perhaps how change happens. So that next time when you read a history book, you'll be like, but where are the women? When the women existed, they were there. I saw this book previously. So, in our own ways, with whatever, things we have at our disposal, whatever gifts we have to start making that change.
What are your thoughts on, Ira, this again, to the earlier question, about history, about curriculum, for example? So the way history is taught in schools, and that is where I think you form your basic ideas about society. And
Yeah, it is. And it is actually the reason why I wrote my very first book, Heroines, was for my daughters, because I found that there were not enough, role models, heroic role models that were women. And how do we define heroism? Can we change the way in which we define heroic women? And I think it starts at that level when children are small and are, absorbing so many important influences. And as an example, I would give the very well-known story of Lakshmi Bai, Rani of Jhansi, and next to her Hazrat Mahal, who did just as much as Lakshmi Bai, but who is entirely forgotten and does not get the same space in history books. And why is that? Let us question that, which I've also done in my book. Was it because she was a Muslim woman? She did not fit into this perfect ideal of a Brahmin widow with her child by her side, defending her child's right to the throne. She was a courtesan. She came up from very lowly beginnings. She was a divorced woman. Are these the reasons that we have tended to forget about her, that school books do not exalt her the way they do Lakshmi Bai? So absolutely, it starts at the school level, and it is very simple. It is a very simple job to look at these stories carefully and see how much they have been restructured to fit a Brahminical patriarchal ideal, and how the original stories differ from what we are being told, and go back to the original stories and find these truly inspiring people.
That's also very interesting, Ira, what you're saying, that even when you're talking about women or giving them space in textbooks, school or later in higher educational institutions, you are actually eliminating a particular kind of women who you think could challenge your notions of conventional society or conventional institutions.
That's right.
And, but is it changing at all? I mean, with your work and then Ruby Lal's work, I mean, do you find historiography is changing now?
I think there's a questioning of historiography. You see more women entering the space, more women academics, and even male writers are slowly beginning to accept that there has been a lot of interest. Which is a very positive thing. The readers are interested in these stories. They were interested in My Daughters of the Sun. They wanted to know about these Mughal women. So that, at a very simple level, the economics will drive that. If people want to read these books and buy them, male or not male, we have to find a way to make it palatable to the males out there. But then there will be more people writing about them. And I think in the past 5 years, since, I've been writing 5 to 7 years, there has been a huge surge in interest about these kind of subjects and people entering this field. And little by little, it's slow, but a questioning of what we define history and how can we change that. So yes, I think it is happening.
Okay, Angellica, there's a question for you. Young women trying to get into politics are faced with a large amount of initial backlash from their families, from social media, and from society, even more in today's times for women belonging to minorities. How do you suggest this backlash can be dealt with?
And that's an interesting question. But before I address that one, can I go back to the earlier one about curriculums? Because it's something of that interests me a lot, because changing of curriculums is something the Northeastern people have been asking for a long period now, because of the kind of racism that we face across the country, right? And one thing, looking at it from the policy aspect, what we see is those people sitting in a room and deciding the curriculum, we need representation there. So when we have women sitting at the table, they would ask for women's history to be included. When we have people sitting, people from the Northeastern community or from the Bahujan community, they will ask for their histories to be included, right? So for example, a simple example that I would like to give is when another policy, when the GST policy was implemented, and it so happened that there were no women in the room, therefore they started taxing sanitary napkins at 18%, whereas something like khakra was 0% taxed, right? Because something that is basic for women, the men in the room didn't understand that it's a basic necessity, because they were just thinking about it from their own perspectives. So it's very important to have people belonging to various diversity groups to be present at the decision-making tables for things to change, for policies to change. That's how I would address that question. And coming to the part about women in politics, I agree that it's extremely difficult for women in politics, and especially, for first generation young women like me, who have come from a completely, my family has no politicians like dur tak, and it was completely by choice. And if we look at how women politicians, the statistics, and it so happens that it's only 1 by 3 of the women that who come through the political system through the youth politics mechanism, to the student politics mechanism. Otherwise, the others are either, they belong to political families, or they are they have to replace after their husbands have been assassinated, or those sort of thing. And it's not just in India, it's a trend all over. So a study has found that it's only 1.3% of women who come from the student politics background because of the issues that they believe in. And it is the main channel even in India. If it were not for student politics, then I would have never been able to get into the political system, because there are so many entry barriers. As a young woman, I wouldn't understand where to go and get a membership. Even if after getting a membership, I mean, everyone can get an online membership nowadays. Some political parties have started online membership. But where do you go from the online membership to the other next stage of getting a responsibility and getting work done, right? So there is no demarcation of roles, so to speak. There is no institutionalized mechanism that says that this is what happens when you join a political party. So everything there is either about psychophancy, knowing the right people, or being at the right place at the right time, and then you get a job. So it's extremely difficult for women, and even more so for minority young women from the minority sections. So how we can simplify this is by ensuring that there is more discussions about women politicians. We normalize the conversations about women politicians. We bring their stories and we make it relatable for young women and their families to understand that politics is not just about muscle power or money power. It's something that even young women can enter and make a change in. And it's very important because it's called the role model effect, right? So we need to be able to present them, because when we were growing up, the only role models that we seemed to know were of Indira Gandhi, and she was a prime minister, and then that was one name that we grew up hearing. But after that, we have not even seen another woman prime minister in India. And it's very essential for us to see women as capable leaders, as role models, and make our young children understand that politics is not as dirty as it is perceived to be. And this is one work that I run a foundation which is trying to get more women into the political space. And what we aim to do is we have been actively engaging in conversations with all the established women politicians. We present their stories on social media, we hold town halls, and we make their stories relatable and accessible to everyone, so that they feel that, okay, that person, that member of parliament, she's not, she doesn't come from a political family. She's come from a background just like me. I could be like her someday, that all feeling that it's nothing, like it's not reaching for the stars, you can achieve it. I think it all boils down to that.
This is an interesting question. Maybe I would like to take it. The performance or archival, I can only see, I don't know where it's beginning, but from wherever I'm reading it, the performance or archival research proposes interdisciplinary connections between study of literature, history, performance, and gender. How does material memory play a role in telling stories of women artists that seek to connect materials from past with our representations of them in present? Ira?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question there, Monobina.
I think I don't know if I'm reading. It's
okay.
Sharnya, is that the full question? It starts with performance. Okay.
I think the person's trying to ask what is the role of material memory in telling the stories of women artists that seek to connect materials from the past and representations of them in the present. So like a lot of partition history has been documented through the material remnants of it. So I think, what is the role of that in the erasure of how women are represented now with regard to art?
I don't know if I'm the best, to answer that. I haven't written about a lot of artists.
Someone else,
Archana? Yeah.
Well, at a grassroots level, you have had women who, say, Madhubani art. That was something which was done by women. And when they paint, they would obviously paint what concerns them, right? The paintings would be more about their activities. And so that is a representation, in a way, that is a voice, which may not be a written voice, but there is a physical voice of old paintings and all. But I would like to say here that, women, because they were confined, they did not, it's not that they had much less chance to do things. Not only that, they whatever they did was not recorded. If it was recorded, it was forgotten or sidelined. But at the end of the day, the number of activities that they did outside the home, outside, say, child minding or looking after the house, in terms of culturally, politically, or other fields of endeavor, they were much less than what men did. There was less to record. And this is something we must, which was because you simply had so much less opportunity. But whatever they did was also not recorded. So some of the records we have are in the form of these art forms, right? In paintings or, but it's not there to, and in the climate of India, these things deteriorate. Very few paintings remain, very few, I don't think we have had too many women sculptors. Dance itself is not something which you can record. You just have, music again, you would know, their stories may be there, but the physicality is not there. It just fades away over time. And there is a cost to replication and remembering it. And that expense or that effort is not, as they said, the voices of women fade away. Even if it was recorded, even if something was created, when you have to copy a manuscript and you can't copy every manuscript to preserve it, their manuscript would be probably the last to be copied. So that is an issue. Here, besides something, when everybody was saying something, it just came to my mind that in the stories of all the women rulers that I wrote about, almost none of them really made it a point to support other women. If they came into power, it's not that they appointed women ministers or they created other women warriors, while they may be living that life of decision. One of the exceptions, when you're talking about Rani Lakshmi Bai, she was an exception because she created, she took women from all walks of life across all castes. One of her gunners was this Motibai Natakwali, who used to be part of her husband's dance troupe. And so she is an exception. You have some Velu Nachiyar from the south. She was the ruler of the small kingdom called Shivganga. She created a women's army. But these are you have Belwadi Mallamma in the south, who again had a women's army. But mostly when women get into a position of power, some of them do, but most of them don't make special efforts to include other women or to get them into positions of power. And this is something that, as individuals, in our spaces at least, to, help along the revolution, we should do whatever we can to whatever extent we can, because that itself will make a change.
Yeah, I think what you're saying has got more to do with power, and which is kind of, in a way, power affects, impacts, mostly, it's gender neutral. Once you achieve perhaps power, and if it's absolute power, then you start, leveraging it in ways which,
for them. I'm not blaming them, because for them it was a case of daily survival. If you see the lives of these women,
I'm sure you're not blaming them.
They were not looking at, okay, I need to support the minorities and I need to do all of that. I think they were just saying, how do I get this done fastest, best, easiest? And they were following that mode of decision making. But yes, if they'd managed to create more role models, and I think, as Angellica said, there's a huge role, role models make a difference. So that is something.
Before we wind up, Angellica?
Yeah, I'll just add on to what Archana has said, right? The whole notion, this is not just in terms of power, but it's in every sphere of life. Patriarchy has played out in such manner that they have pitted women against women. They tend to say that औरत ही औरत की दुश्मन होती है, एक औरत दूसरे को औरत के साथ काम नहीं कर सकती. All these things have been embedded into the heads of women, right? And it's a manifestation of patriarchy in itself. So, and the foundation of this lies in the fact that when women are shown just a piece of the pie when you have a whole pie, but then you are shown just a piece of the pie and you are taught to fight, amongst yourself for that piece, rather than telling them that you have the whole piece and you can all share it. And even the men in the room, we all have equal rights over that pie. But women are always shown like you have 33% reservation. You have to fight for yourselves amongst this 33%. The others are ours. For example, in a committee form, out of 10 people that have to be selected, one will be a token seat for women. One seat for women, so women have to fight for that one seat, while the others will be only for the men. So that kind of perception has been put into the women because of patriarchy. And I think Archana is extremely right. It plays even more so at the higher levels, when it comes to political positions and, in powerful positions. And as it is our responsibility, whenever we talk about it, we should make younger people and the women within the society know that we should not fall into the hands of patriarchy. We should not be fighting against each other. Let's fight for a bigger cause. I think that's what it is.
I think before we wind up, I can't resist asking Ira about her next book. Do you have anything in mind? Are you working on?
I am. I don't have a very specific idea, but it'll be later. It'll be the 18th century. It'll be some of these fragmented courts that we have in the 18th century, because there was very interesting thing happening. We can question the way in which the Europeans wrote about the decadence of certain courts, look at it from a new perspective, challenge that perception, and bring in more women as usual into the narrative.
Angellica, of course, we look forward to your book, and Archana, whatever you're writing, we look forward to reading it. Thank you very much for participating in this highly engaging conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I think you've all brought in such different perspectives, and I think we're ending on a great note, which is that we have to make space for more women so that we're not fighting for that one seat. We need to ensure that there are more seats on the table, for everyone. And so I think that it's honestly been a really good session. I think the audience has also really been very active and engaged a lot. Like the numbers were amazing. We almost touched 100 in the middle, which is fantastic engagement, I think. So it goes to show how rich the panel discussion really was. So thank you so much, everyone, for being so committed to this particular session. I really appreciate it, and I think everyone really enjoyed.
Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you, Monobina.
Thank you, Monobina.
Thank you so much.
Ira, Angellica, Archana, and Sharnya, of course.
Thank you.